He absolutely does not believe that Ukraine should be looking elsewhere other than to Russia, and can't understand who these people are that think it should be. Therefore, he labels them, these must be extremists, these must be whatever words he chooses. These can't possibly be Ukrainians with the best interests of Ukraine at heart. But I didn't think that he would take the risk. And I think he made some assumptions that were wrong. I think he assumed President Zelensky would run or be extracted. I think he assumed that Europe would be disunited. And I think he assumed that the US would not be as clear-cut as it was about its support.
This is Matt Chorley on Times Radio. Now, we could talk a lot about what happens in international diplomacy, but we don't very often get to find out what's really going on in those sealed rooms, what used to be smoke-filled rooms. Well, somebody who does know is Catherine Ashton, Baroness Ashton, who is an EU Trade Commissioner and then the first High Representative for Foreign Security Policy and first Vice President of the Commission for 5 years for the European Union. That's quite a mouthful.
It is. We'd called it HRVP for short.
You were essentially the foreign minister of the European Union.
Well, some people would have said that. There were a number of countries.
Did you get cross if people said that?
No, I didn't get cross. But I think for some countries, they felt it was not the right terminology. As I understand it, when they were kind of coming up with the title, that was something that people said, why don't we call it foreign minister? A few countries said, oh, no, we have foreign ministers. This is different.
It does. The job title does read a bit like something written by a committee, so maybe that explains why.
I'm sure it was.
Let's start with the job then, and how you got the job. You'd been in the House of Lords. You've been a government minister in the New Labour years. You've been an EU Trade Commissioner, and the really striking thing in your book when you recount it is it seemed like everyone in the world knew that you were having this job before you did.
Well, I'm not sure everyone in the world. There were certainly quite a few people who claimed afterwards that they'd seen it coming, and a few people who I genuinely think did. But it just seemed such an unlikely proposition. Again, you look back, and there was clarity to me that they wanted the Brits to have an important job. They wanted a woman somewhere in the system, and they wanted somebody who wasn't in the Conservative group. Well, if you put British woman, not Conservative together, in the context of Europe, there weren't that many people they knew. And I was already there as Trade Commissioner, so I guess I was the best known.
But you found out from Sky News, is that right?
That was becoming Trade Commissioner.
Oh, right, okay, that was becoming the Trade Commissioner.
Right.
I've got that modelled up. So you didn't even know about that?
Well, no, not at all. I came home and discovered my name was kind of going around the ticker tape on Sky or the BBC as the person to replace Peter Mandelson, who was coming back.
Going back to serve for gone about.
And then you just wait and hope that somebody will let you know whether this is real or not, or indeed might even ask you whether that's what you'd like to do.
Do you get asked, or you just get told? Does Gordon Brown ask you, or is it just you've probably seen by now you're off to Brussels?
To be fair, there is an assumption that you'll serve, and you'll serve your country if asked to. And there's an assumption, too, that if you've been involved in going to Europe, which I was as a Justice Minister, and I'd taken the Lisbon Treaty through the House of Lords, it was a fair, recognition that I probably would be interested. Having said that, of course, it meant me moving countries, which from a family and friend point of view is a bit trickier.
How did you find going from, obviously, like you said, as a minister, you had interactions with the EU and the sort of Brussels machinery. Sometimes I remember speaking to certainly Lib Dem ministers, ardently pro-European. Their day-to-day interactions with the EU made them rather more Eurosceptic, I think. They found that was a bit... You also found yourself right in the middle of the machine. Did you feel like this was an institution that was working?
It's really funny. When I first went to my first committee meetings as a minister in Britain, I remember very clearly thinking this is like a mini House of Lords, in that you've got lots of different views. Everybody's an individual, believes, of course, in their own knowledge and the importance of their position. But it's all about coalitions and bringing people together and trying to find a way through. So it felt, for me, reminiscent of how the Lords works. Going into it, sure, there are lots of things that you get frustrated about because you're trying to manage your country's relationship with a whole group of other nations and with an institutional framework that's not your own. So yeah, you have to kind of do it. And undoubtedly, all countries, not least our own, would get really frustrated and fed up from time to time.
And who were the countries that you saw as your allies in doing those things?
Certainly in my experience of both in trade, when I was a Justice Minister going into Brussels, and then later in Foreign Affairs, you would look at, first of all, the big countries that you were close to. So Germany and France, for different issues we would be talking to. There was a lot of consideration, I think, from this country about the views of countries on the east, from Poland and the Baltic states and so on, who we had felt very strongly should be part of the EU and wanted to kind of nurture, I suppose, in those roles in those early days when they were first members. But almost anything, there would be at least one or two countries who were experts, either because of geography or because of history, on any subject. And so we kind of were good at gathering together the countries who had similar views and similar ideas.
That whole period, the sort of mid to late noughties, there was a lot going on in Brussels, the passing of the Lisbon Treaty. There's this weird, Britain's relationship was even getting a bit weird then. We were supposedly had a Labour government fully signed up members of the European Union, but Gordon Brown doesn't go and sign it with everyone else and was sort of snuck in through the back door. Your face suggests you don't think that was a smart move.
It was one of those moments, Matt, where I understood. I mean, Gordon's agenda, as all prime ministers, is a nightmare. And it wasn't that he didn't want to, but logistics are logistics. But we were just about to take the Lisbon Treaty into the House of Lords, and I can remember my worry that we wouldn't have signed it, and it was important that we were kind of dealing with it properly. So, yeah, it was tricky.
So you had sort of that, and that sort of provoked a bit of fun. And then you taking that job, the High Representative for Foreign Security Policy and First Vice President of the Commission, and coupled with Herman Van Rompuy and so on as well, gave your Nigel Farages, your Conservative Eurosceptics, quite a big target to go at. Do you think that, and then ultimately David Cameron became more Eurosceptic, ultimately promising a referendum. Do you think that Lisbon Treaty process and Britain taking one of those big jobs helped make the case for those who argued against Britain's membership of an ever closer European Union?
I'm not sure, because I think the Lisbon Treaty, the criticism that was levelled at it was it had replaced a new constitution, and that was all about whether you should have a referendum on something that important. I took in the House of Lords the view that Margaret Thatcher always held, which is that referendums should be used sparingly and well. And I did not think that this was an issue. The Lisbon Treaty was an issue that we should use with a referendum. We had elected representatives. Their job was to read it, understand it, and make some decisions about it. No question that there were certainly moments when I felt that there was someone that they could point to and say, look, here's an example of somebody who, in a job that shouldn't exist, Europe trying to do things it shouldn't do. And I understood that. For people who felt that Europe and the European Union was not where we should be, of course they were going to look and say, well, this is just an additional responsibility they're taking away from nation states, an additional thing that we don't need.
Do you feel like Brexit was your fault a bit?
No, I don't. There were, as far as I'm concerned, moments that I hoped showed how important Britain's role was in amplifying the things that we cared about through 27 other countries. There's no question that foreign ministers from David Miliband to William Hague to Philip Hammond, all the people I worked with, were regarded as strong allies, really, of many countries around the table in the context of the same values and ideas and wanting to make sure that we provided for the country security and safety, as well as the international issues that are so important. And I think that was a really important part of what we did. And as we look now, it's about finding another way to do that, of being able to have those links with countries that we live next door to, but who share many of the same values.
Just on the point about referendums, because there had been a promise of a referendum on a new constitution. And then there was a debate about whether or not Lisbon Treaty amounted to the same thing. But in putting the idea of a European referendum out there, would it have been better, do you think, if the Labour government had had one and you'd won it, and then we wouldn't have had David Cameron promising another one 5 years later? That actually Labour opened the door to that, started people talking about the possibility or the necessity or the fairness or the keeping of promises. Do you think that would have been better if they'd have delivered on the promise?
You know, hindsight's always great, isn't it? I don't know, because I think at the time, you know, the distinction, whether you call it a legal nicety, there was a distinction. The Lisbon Treaty wasn't a constitution. And so you had to stick within the framework. I mean, one of the arguments that's made about how Europe is that it's got all these laws and rules. Well, if you've got 27 countries, as you do now, you need a lot of framework in order to make sure that you can manage that relationship. And the Lisbon Treaty fitted into that in a particular way. So I don't know whether that would have made a difference.
It was interesting looking at so many of the things that you covered during your time there. I mean, more towards the end, but Ukraine sticks out. You were in the job when there were democracy protests in Ukraine. You went to Kyiv, you saw the protests yourself. And of course, back then we had a situation, we had a Ukrainian president who wanted closer ties to Russia, and other countries, the EU, weren't sure. Explain what was going on in Ukraine then, and were concerns you had then, have they been sort of borne out now?
It's even more interesting than you've described it, because President Yanukovych, who was the president for most of my time in office, had stood on a platform of support for this closer relationship with Europe. An association agreement, it's called. It's got trade in it. It's also got closer, you know, working together on anti-corruption, all kinds of areas, technology and so on, beneficial to Ukraine, with so many industries and so many opportunities that it would get to be able to improve its economy. And he decided, having 7 years of negotiation, having initialed it, so the negotiators had finished the job, because as you know, initialing means we're done. All he had to do was come and sign it. And he came to the meeting and told me that he couldn't sign it, with all the heads of state and government of Europe waiting for this great moment of this cementing of a stronger relationship with Ukraine. So the demonstrations were inevitable, really, from people who said, well, hang on a minute, you stood on this platform, this is what you said you were going to do. We want a stronger relationship with Europe. We think it's better for us economically and politically. What do you mean you're not signing it? And so the demonstrations began in Maidan and continued across the country. And I got involved quite early on because, of course, they were holding EU flags, because this was about the relationship with the EU. And in trying to understand why the president had decided at this kind of 11th hour that he wasn't going to sign it.
And what was the reason?
Fundamentally, the relationship with Russia. That for whatever reasons, it had kind of come to a head. And it was very clear that he felt that the pressure from Russia meant that he shouldn't and couldn't sign it. There were lots of discussions about money that Russia might be giving to support the Ukrainian economy. There were lots of discussions that he would suddenly talk about the problems of the industry in the East that looked to Russia. And it became clear to me, after listening to him sometimes for hours on end, that he was never going to sign this.
And what do you make then of the EU's response since? Did the European Union take its eye off the ball? I mean, there's been lots of other things going on in the meantime. Pandemic, Brexit, all feeds into it. Did the EU do enough to support Ukraine ahead of what happened almost exactly a year ago when Russia invaded?
Sometimes I think, and this is not just for the EU, but it's true generally, things get kind of stuck and nobody really understands how to unstick them. If you think about Georgia, Georgia's had the problem of breakaway regions since 2008. They've still got the barbed wire. There's still a monitoring mission from the EU monitoring it, but nothing has really changed. And so too in Ukraine. I think because the overt fighting stopped, there were small incursions. there was a sense of this was kind of stuck, and nobody really found the diplomatic means to unstick it in either direction. In fact, it was the place I was just before lockdown. The last visit I made was to Kyiv, and talking with people about how they felt. I think for many Ukrainians there was a sense of, where's everybody gone? We need more help. And that's not to discredit any of the work that was going on by the EU, but I think there was simply a sense of nobody quite knew how to shift this. Russia wasn't moving. Yes, there were sanctions. That was having some effect. Was it having enough? Could you justify making those sanctions stronger at that point? That was a difficult discussion, I think, within many nations, because sanctions, as people, I think, sometimes forget, have an impact on your economy if they're any good.
As we've seen.
Right, that's right.
Since then. It was hindsight again, I suppose. If the European Union, in fact the West generally, had had the collective determination we've seen since the invasion, before the invasion, it might not have happened. Actually, we've seen such a big shift, particularly, I suppose, from Germany, more than anywhere else. That sort of hoped everything would be all right.
But the situation we were dealing with when Russia decided to invade was a massive escalation and, in a sense, a different situation, because this was about, the tanks literally rolling in. And the situation before then was extremely difficult for certain parts of Ukraine, but the rest was largely unaffected, and it did feel more like a sort of frozen conflict for which the tools you use are diplomatic and sanctions, they're not military. So if we had suddenly sent in support militarily and the time before, that would have been perhaps a different provocation potentially, or at least a different relationship to it. And Russia could have argued it in a different way. When Russia decided to do what it did a year ago, to invade, it was clearer. And sometimes in the diplomatic world, international relations, and again, you'll know this well, clarity helps, because so many situations are less clear. You're not absolutely sure what to do. You're not often sure what you're actually looking at a lot of the time. But, this was clear.
You've presumably been in the room with Putin many times. What's he like for people who haven't been in a room with him? Because he's this extraordinary, he's the incredible creation of propaganda as well. But as a person to deal with, what's it like sitting across from Vladimir Putin?
So the first thing that you're aware of is somebody who has a real sense of power. He's not an imposing person, but he doesn't sit across and make small talk or do other than say, by everything about him, I'm the most important person in this room. He listens more carefully than you ever think he's listening, because for sure he'll pick up on the one thing that you weren't sure about when you said it. He makes clear what it is he's interested in talking about. And he, in the context of many of the discussions we had, I had sort of two completely different relationships there. One was on the Iran negotiations, where, of course, he was an ally, if you like. He was on my team of the 6 nations who were negotiating under the sort of EU chairmanship. And so when we talked about that, it was as people moving in the same direction. And then when we talked about Ukraine or in the Western Balkans, I was talking to somebody who was wholly unsupportive of what we were doing, extremely angry at times that we were trying to do things that he thought were not in the best interests of Russia.
Did you like him?
You often don't find yourself even contemplating liking or disliking people, because in those particular meetings or in the way that you're dealing with them, this is not about forming a relationship with somebody beyond having the dialogue across the table. There's plenty of people that you meet in different circumstances, mainly people you just meet in the street, actually, people whose lives have been disrupted or upended, that it's impossible not to like or respect or admire or weep for. But when it comes to leaders in those particular contexts, you don't get into that, do I like this person or not? It's, I have to do this transaction with them.
And what about it feels like, Tony Blair brought Vladimir Putin to the UK on a state visit. David Cameron thought he could thaw the relationship. You know, there's a constant decision-making process about this guy. What do we do with him? Do we hug him close? You know, do you keep your enemies close, or do you, you know? And clearly, you know, for entirely understandable reasons, they tried that, and it didn't work. Were you surprised by what happened a year ago? That he did end up doing the thing that everyone feared, but he hadn't done for so long?
I was surprised. I was surprised because I thought he immediately underestimated what response there would be. You know, he seems to me to be someone driven by this combination of history and legacy. The history for him is about where Russia fits in the world. He does not want it to be regarded as some kind of regional power, which I think President Obama once described Russia as. He wanted it to be seen as a vital, crucial kind of superpower. Yeah. And the history of that and his determination that Russia was going to be seen and respected, if not liked, was absolutely crystal clear. And legacy was he was not going to let Ukraine get away. He absolutely does not believe that Ukraine should be looking elsewhere other than to Russia, and can't understand who these people are that think it should be. Therefore, he labels them. You know, these must be extremists, these must be whatever words he chooses. These can't possibly be Ukrainians with the best interests of Ukraine at heart. Completely to misunderstand or choose to misunderstand who they are, what they're trying to do, and the relationships that they feel are going to be important for the growth and development of their own country. That's who he is. So I knew all that, but I didn't think that he would take the risk. And I think he made some assumptions that were wrong. I think he assumed President Zelensky would run or be extracted. I think he assumed that Europe would be disunited. And I think he assumed that the US would not be as clear-cut as it was about its support.
I suspect as a Labour peer and former senior figure in the EU that there's not much to admire about Boris Johnson. But do you admire the leadership that he's shown, actually ahead of quite a lot of the EU's response? That actually, you know, in part led by Germany, the EU was slower to respond in terms of showing support and providing military support. Do you admire Boris Johnson's response? I
think what Boris Johnson has done is absolutely, on this, the right thing to do, which is to be very strong and very clear. I suppose a bit of me thinks, well, wouldn't it have been good if he'd been sitting around the European Council doing that and projecting Britain's position into that room and having those regular meetings and discussions with all of those countries. The challenge, though, is of itself, you know, moving forward in terms of providing support, the military support, etc. It's fine, it's not enough. What matters is also what's underneath all that. And that's where I think I would have some concerns that we need to be thinking about what the future holds. My book is called And Then What? And there's a reason for that, which I used to go around saying it all the time. Well, and then what? So in 10 years...
There's never an end to these things. There's always the next...
There's always the next thing. Yeah. But also you've got to think about the next chapter. You know, it's hard to imagine now a situation for Ukraine in 5 years or 10 years. But we've got to start thinking about it. We've got to think about the diplomatic efforts that need to go on. This is not about negotiating with Russia now. This is about saying there will need to be in the future conversations and dialogues and discussions that are really going to work out how do we keep Ukraine safe and secure? What does this mean for the future of Europe? What relationships with Russia will look like? And I'm not convinced in the sort of Boris Johnson stuff that we're seeing any of that thinking. That may be a disservice to him or to those in government. But I'd like to see more of that, at least, you know, being thought about. I
suppose there's two things going on, isn't there? There's the debate about ultimately Ukraine joining the EU, which there's been, you know, support for from lots of quarters. Alongside, at some point, we're going to have a situation, we assume, where there will be some sort of talks. And the pressure on Ukraine to end this thing, cede territory possibly to Russia, it's going to take a lot of willpower, not just from Ukraine, but from the West, to not say, oh, just do that. And then the thing can go away and our gas prices can go back to normal and we can pretend it didn't happen.
People have died. People have suffered terribly in Ukraine. There are millions of Ukrainians having to live outside the country. There are people here living with families, trying to make something of a life where they constantly think to what's going on at home. That's really difficult to imagine, saying to them, oh, by the way, when you get back, we're going to have organised it so you don't quite live where you used to, or you don't quite have the country that you used to have. There will have to be, at some point, an end to this. And the question that I think Ukraine needs to start considering is, who do they want in the room to help them work out what this is going to be? You know, there has to come a point when they decide. It's their country. It's not for us to tell them what to do. But it's going to be about who is their support. So I often say when I talk about negotiation generally to people, you know, you have to begin with what's the process you're going to use? Where are you going to go? And who are you going to talk to? Because when things change and when you are looking at whether it's simply how do they get back the people that have disappeared into Russia, we don't know where they are. What's the process you're going to use to do that? Or what's going to happen about repairing and rebuilding the nation? What are you going to do about the security in the longer term? And what does that mean for a Russia that we don't yet know in 10 or 20 years? So there's a lot of things that need to be considered, thinking a bit of the unthinkable about the fact that it could be entirely different. That's all really important, very difficult for President Zelensky and his people to do right now. But people who know this stuff really ought to be thinking about it, because it's actually going to be really important to make sure that Ukraine, when Ukraine wants to talk to anyone, is able to do so, knowing it's got really a lot of support that it needs.
It's just funny that you talk about negotiations or getting in the room with people. We don't know from the outside what goes on. Take us into the world of diplomacy, when things go well or when things go badly. I remember reading in Barack Obama's memoirs, he talked about being at a sort of international summit, and he sort of stormed into a room, I think it was a Chinese delegation, because everything was being held up. And sometimes you need to storm into the room. So to take us into some of the smoke-filled rooms or not that you found yourself into.
President Obama did that at it was the climate change negotiation.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, I remember the story. I remember hearing the story from the people around him. So the thing about the room is that when people get into it, you are not there, i.e. the press and the outside world. And so there is automatically a different atmosphere. And it's not like a group of friends going into a room, but it is people who, in a sense, can just change their demeanour a little bit and have come to do a serious piece of work. But they're no longer thinking about the outside world. And that's the first thing that you notice. The second thing that happens is that if you're going to get serious about it, you find ways to start the conversation. I talk again a lot about the warm-up. When I was doing the Iran negotiations, I always had dinner with the Iranian foreign minister the night before. What was I doing? I wasn't talking about the negotiations, but I was finding out what mood they were in, what was going on at home, discussing the process we were going to use, finding out how they were feeling about various things, so that when we met formally across the table, I could begin by saying, thank you for dinner. And the ice was already long broken. So really important, what you often see are people just talking to each other about anything. It could be the weather, the journey, anything. And it is about just having that bit of human contact before you sit down. And then what do you find is that discussions take a particular direction, either because you've got an agenda or more likely because something is going on. There's a change of view or there's an idea that's come up and you start to have those conversations. And if you're really lucky, they last a long time, not because you want to spend 10 hours or 12 hours, and we often did and longer, but because you're getting to the heart of the problem. And I always say to people with me, you can tell when you're getting somewhere when they start arguing about the detail. You know, they're no longer arguing about the concept. They've kind of got into the, well, I don't like this, but the this.
So they've already conceded you're getting somewhere.
Right, they're 2 layers in, and you're thinking, well, they've jumped a layer, and you don't let those conversations go. And one of the things that I found really important was don't break the mood. You know, Don't come in with a coffee. Don't.
Oh, really? Lock the door.
Almost
Don't let
lock
anyone
the
in.
door.
Don't let anyone leave.
Just let it flow to the point. There'll come a natural break anyway, but don't interrupt the flow, because that's how you kind of get somewhere. And a lot of what happens formally, again, thinking Iran negotiations, we used to begin with a plenary at the UN building where the cameras would all come in waves, because there was quite a lot of interest, and we'd all sit formally, and we might even say a few words. The cameras would go, and we would often leave the building, go back to the hotels and meet somewhere else where you could be more relaxed and meet in smaller groups. And that actually, again, is sort of makes a difference in how you're able to make a breakthrough.
And then sometimes you have to literally chase people down corridors.
Well, that certainly happened to me. And it's, one of the things that I found really interesting about working with leaders is how difficult leadership can be. It's often easier to do nothing. You get elected, that's taken you quite a lot of effort. You've had to climb your party and then get through the election. And doing something that could make you unpopular with your base, a word we hear a lot about these days, or with people who you've probably brought into your kind of coalition, is really hard. So getting people to move and actually make an agreement that could be risky for them politically is one of the most challenging things to do. And in the case of the Serbia-Kosovo agreement, which was the first agreement between them, these were people that had never met and who could tell you about the Battle of 1389, the Battle of Kosovo, at the drop of a hat. That when we got to the point of the Kosovo Prime Minister signing, he literally ran down the corridor and I ran after him. And when we caught up with him, we found a room and I found a tiny little flag, put it on the desk for the photo, and he signed and so did I. And at that moment, you felt the weight lift.
Because if you'd have left the building, you'd have been back, you several, if not back to square one, several steps.
I was never going to let him leave the building.
Well, Catherine Ashton, Baroness Ashton, thanks. We will now let you leave the building, but thanks for joining us on Times Radio.
Thank you.